With Neil Armstrong's first step onto the surface of the moon, America's race with the Russians had come to an end.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Riding on the coattails of 2 successful moon missions, America planned to launch Apollo 13, its 3rd manned mission to explore the lunar surface in April 1970. Unforeseen problems occurred during this mission that created a life and death situation where the spacecraft and crew were all but lost. This is the true story of the Apollo 13 mission, as told by some of the unsung heroes who were there and able to cheat death, avoid disaster, and keep the crew from being lost in space. The astronauts for Apollo 13 were chosen a year before the launch, commanded by the world's most experienced astronaut, James A. Lovell Jr. He had already spent nearly 600 hours in space as a crew member on 2 Gemini flights and Apollo 8, the first round trip to the moon. The other 2 astronauts accompanying Lovell were both rookies. The lunar module pilot was Fred Hayes, and the command module pilot was Thomas Ken Mattingly. A backup crew trains on the same equipment for the same mission in the event the prime crew cannot go. The commander of the backup crew was John Young, with Charles Duke as the lunar module pilot and James Swigert as the command module pilot. Few people realize how many hundreds of hours these astronauts and flight controllers spent in training and simulating mission activities. Every action and movement during their mission were carefully planned and well thought out, which were the real secrets to the successes of the Apollo program.
The simulations that we ran were very high fidelity. They were very much like a real flight. Sitting in the control center, we couldn't tell the difference between whether it was a simulation or a real flight. It looked exactly the same. In the simulation, people could throw faults into the system, and we test us to see if we handled them correctly.
Thousands of problems and failures had been considered, documented, and simulated throughout the history of the space program. These training sessions formed the basis of the rules each mission followed.
Mission rules were all written to give you time to deal with issues that you didn't realize were going to happen, and not very many times did anything happen that we didn't have a pre-planned operation for. Sometimes they were disparate or sometimes not directly associated with each other as they had happened in a simulation, but the flight controllers at that point in time in Apollo were very well trained, I believe, to handle most anything that could happen.
We tried to cover at best what we thought were all the thousands of credible failures that could happen to both the spacecraft and the mission. There were always some people offline, including myself, but some key people that worked for me, that would sit around at night and dream up worst-case contingencies and what-ifs, and draw out solutions on the back of a napkin, kind of an arrangement, that weren't subjected to formal training. So there was always a lot of what-if this really does happen.
The crewmen tried to play it out as close as possible to what was really happening. That is, they played it like it was real. Even the far-out cases where it was almost too difficult to survive, they played them all the way through. That didn't mean we didn't crash on the moon sometimes. It was not our intention to practice for disaster. I mean, you don't need to do that. But we would give them situations, and in any of these situations, you might do the wrong thing the first time, and then you go back and think about what you would do and then change your response and get better at it.
Simulation people would hit us with a failure and we'd handle it. They'd hit us with another and hit us, and they would just finally, they'd load us up so heavy that they knew they could finally break us if they just kept working at it. And so we had some good-natured ribbing quite often between us, where we would say, look, get realistic. You get all those failures aren't going to happen.
And in the process of training, we crashed many times into the moon. Other times we'd get very nervous about what was happening with the guidance system, and we'd abort unnecessarily. to the point where we really started losing confidence in our own ability as controllers and our ability as a team.
The simulation team has to be able to defend their selection of a failure. That's about the only thing they have to answer for. They can be merciless in their scripting. They do it real time. They take great delight, and they're really good. I mean, they are just superb, and as a result, we all learned a great deal about how to deal with the systems and how they worked, and made our rules better because we try things that worked and didn't.
Lovell, Hayes, and Mattingly spent every minute of every day for over a year in simulators and training for this specific mission. They were ready and prepared to meet their destiny in space. Their spacecraft was by far the most complex piece of machinery ever sent into space. The Saturn V rocket booster had 3 stages and was over 40 stories high. Sitting on top of this rocket were the command, service, and lunar modules. The command module capsule, shown here in deep blue and named Odyssey, was where the crew were to stay for their journey. The service module, shown here in silver and red, was where the propulsion system and compressed air were located. The lunar module, it was to take Lovell and Hayes to the moon's surface, named Aquarius, would be held inside the top of the 3rd stage rocket booster until after launch. Each and every one of the 6 million parts making up the spacecraft had to be tested and retested. But the Apollo 13 spacecraft would be ready to fulfill its task on schedule.
I'd have been on that flight, I'd have started worrying early on. I mean, like, it was Apollo 13. There had never been a 13 in either of the Mercury Gemini programs. I mean, it was going to be the first spacecraft that was called 13. And I can tell you, in the Army, in the military, I mean, like, there's a superstition about numbers in 13. And Marilyn Lovell says that she was superstitious about it. You know, I mean, she didn't like the idea of it being called 13, but Jim Lovell, of course, had no problem with it. I mean, like, he wanted to go. You know, I mean, he could have cared less what you called it.
Just a month before launch, the Apollo 13 jinx appeared for the first time. During a test of the spacecraft's 2 liquid oxygen tanks that supplied the water, electricity, and breathable oxygen, the tanks were supposed to be filled and emptied as a routine check for leaks in the tanks or lines.
We'd had a tanking test on the spacecraft on the ground, and when they went to detank, they were unable to get one of the oxygen tanks to dump its load, and they decided to use the heaters in the tank to boil the oxygen off. And we'd had some fairly lengthy discussions with the engineers about it. I was convinced that our engineering team had a good story. They understood what they were doing, and procedures were sound, and I told Jim he didn't need to worry about it.
Unknown to the engineers or crew, an electrical current overload in one of the oxygen tanks shorted out the heater switch and fused the circuit breaker shut. This malfunction was not identified and turned the tank into a bomb. Only a week before launch, the Apollo 13 jinx appeared again and threw the entire mission into a turmoil.
The problem initially was I was so disappointed that I'd called all that. I'd had the measles, you know, a week before the liftoff, and exposed the whole crew to it, and Ken hadn't had the measles, and so it was a big mess just because I had the 3-day measles.
Sending Mattingly to the moon with the possibility he might come down with the measles was simply unthinkable for NASA. Their only choices were to either scrub the mission entirely, an equally unthinkable prospect, or to replace Mattingly with his backup counterpart, Jack Swigert. Only 2 days before the flight, Mattingly was removed and replaced by Swigert.
Having concentrated 7 days a week, 24 hours a day on an event that's suddenly denied for what you feel is an unreasonable reason, even though intellectually you know that it's a sound decision. Emotionally, you feel like you've been cheated from something important.
And I don't think, from our viewpoint at least, that taking TK out of that seat and putting in Swigert was a big impact. We didn't notice that much different. The backup crews had trained very much like the prime crews, not as much, but obviously they were ready to go.
Well, it was a testimony to our training that they could change out a person in that crew 2 days before launch and still the crew could function.
The Apollo 11 and 12 moon missions were so successful that the Apollo missions began to take on a routine nature, creating a sense of complacency in the public and the media. When launch day came for Apollo 13 on April 11, 1970, the launch itself was met with distinct public apathy and media indifference.
I think something like 7 million people showed up to watch the Apollo 11 blast off. Apollo 12, a few months later, I think there were 2 million people showed up, stood on the beach, watched the blast off. By the time we got to Apollo 13, it was down to about 200,000. And the networks didn't even cover the telecasts.
At exactly 13:13 military time in Houston, the Apollo 13 mission began with the Saturn V rocket lifting the spacecraft toward orbit.
On the way up on the booster, we happened to lose the center engine on the second stage about 2 minutes early. It just shut down due to high vibrations. And for that moment, we thought that this was the crisis of this particular flight, because most space flights, with the exception perhaps of 8, usually had something go wrong with them. But we had enough fuel, we had enough power and enough engine power to get us into Earth orbit and then push us on to the moon.
Once the spacecraft left Earth's orbit, the command and service modules separated from the third stage rocket booster and turned around to dock up with the lunar module. After docking was completed, Springs ejected the lunar, command, and service modules from the Saturn rocket, and the crew flew to the moon in this arrangement.
In Apollo 13, as in all flights that I've ever had anything to do with, you always seem to have some malfunctions that take place. And in Apollo 13, there were several, but I don't think they were earth-shaking or unexpected from the standpoint of problems. I'd say, particularly on Apollo 13, most things were pretty routine and had gone reasonably well, and we were looking forward to the third landing on the moon.
On April 13th, at 54 hours into the flight, Lovell and Hayes were instructed to check out the lunar module.
Okay, Jim, it's been a real good TV show.
They televised their activities back to Houston.
What do you think?
However, none of the networks even bothered to broadcast it.
Apollo 13 was everybody there. Nice evening, and we're just about ready to close out our inspection of Aquarius and get back to a pleasant evening at Odyssey. Good night.
Mission Control noticed a slight pressure drop in one of the oxygen tanks and instructed Swigert to turn on the heaters and stir the tank up. Unknown to the crew at the time, an electrical short circuit sparked a fire in the oxygen tank's protective covering, causing the tank to explode with such force that it blew a huge panel off the service module. The explosion also ruptured the backup oxygen tank.
Okay, we had a problem here. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
And I heard a hiss bang. The spacecraft rocked back and forth. The jet started a fire to stabilize the spacecraft. I looked up at Fred, and Fred looked down at me, and I knew that Fred didn't know what caused this bang. Then I looked over to our third companion, Jack Swigert. He was over there in the left seat, and his eyes were as wide as saucers.
Our life support console and its operator noticed that we were beginning to see the pressure decrease in the oxygen in the service module. And for a time period, we went through the normal steps to try to figure out what that situation might be. Was it some problem with instrumentation, even though the crew had definitely heard something occur? And more importantly, is it something where the procedures we had could isolate that problem?
And we started seeing so many signatures. There were all kinds of strange electrical signatures, things in the fuel cells, things all over didn't match any of the kinds of symptoms that we had been trained to look for. And we felt that we really had run into another one of these bizarre instrumentation failures.
I was looking at the instruments that told me the condition of two huge liquid oxygen tanks that we had way back in the service module. On the quantity gauge of one, it read 0. And on the quantity gauge of the other, I could see the needle slowly go down.
Okay, Houston, I'm showing, I tried to reset, and fuel cell 1 and 3 are both showing gray flags, but they're both showing zip on the flows.
Arnie Aldridge called me, and the question in the dialogue was kind of like this between Arnie and I. He says, John, there's been some kind of an anomaly here, and the guys in the mission control team are chasing it because it seems to be a bunch of unrelated things. It must be some kind of problem with the data relay of all the measurements from the spacecraft.
Initially, no one at Mission Control could believe that there was a complete structural failure of the spacecraft, a situation that was never even simulated before.
So I asked him, I said, Arnie, read me some parameters. So I asked him to call up some econ displays, and he read me some parameters. And I said, well, read me some more. And I said, no, that's not instrumentation failure. Read me some more. And I remember summarizing to him at the end of that conversation, Arnie, I don't know what problem you're chasing out there, but it's a real problem. It's not an instrumentation problem. That problem is real. You have a real problem. I'll be right there.
I went past Jack, looked out the side window, and I could see escaping at a high rate of speed a gaseous substance from the rear end of my spacecraft. And very shortly, we'd be completely out of oxygen. And we'd be completely out of electrical power. And when that occurred, because we gimbaled our maneuvering engine by means of electricity, we would lose our propulsion system.
What started out as a routine milk run to the moon was now turning out to be the single greatest test of NASA's creative ability to solve complex problems on a real-time scale to bring the crew back alive. The mission was lost, and these astronauts were in a broken-down spacecraft almost 200,000 miles from Earth, going in the wrong direction, and had no idea how or if they were going to come home.
On the night of April 13th, I had just come into the control center maybe a half hour ahead of time, and I was getting ready to go on shift. It was my team was going on to the shift to take over from Gene's team, Gene Kranz's team.
We needed time to think. We needed time to establish a plan. We needed time to figure out what was going wrong, what had gone wrong, and then we needed time to figure out what we were going to do about it. So basically, the first activity we had was to buy time.
I think most of the team operated with confidence that we were going to be able to pull it off if it was salvageable at all. But I would have to say that probably each one of us in our own heart of hearts, at some point during the events after the blow-up and before we got stabilized, probably had a little bit of a sinking feeling as to how this thing was going to turn out.
Some people at Mission Control wanted the spacecraft to turn around and return to Earth immediately. But Kranz and Lunny argued that they couldn't depend on the spacecraft's propulsion and needed to build a rescue plan in the simulators.
I think there was a period in there when I think very few people had any idea how we would pull this off. But I think the kind of training that we'd had in the simulations and the kind of people we work with, that even though you don't know what the outcome is, you know, you probably don't have many opportunities to make mistakes.
I was homesick with the measles when the tanks blew up, and I got a call from somebody at Mission Control, said, hey, we've got a real problem here. This thing, we're losing all our oxygen. Can you come in? So I got up, and John and we all went to Mission Control and ended up in Mission Control, all the backup crew. And for the first 10 or 12 hours, in my memory, as I recall it, it looked grim, and we weren't going to make it.
Nobody ever anticipated that they were going to have a problem of this magnitude. I mean, they had never simulated that many system failures. I mean, the electrical system totally failed. The oxygen system totally failed. I mean, those kind of things weren't supposed to happen. They had 2 oxygen tanks because if either one of them broke, the other one would work. I mean, they only needed one of those tanks to make the whole trip. But they carried 2 just to be safe, and suddenly they lost both of them. I mean, like, nobody thought that was ever possible. To where it didn't look good.
With only 15 minutes of electricity left in the command module, Mission Control had to accept the fact that the command and service modules were dying and would have to be shut down completely.
There was never any plans or even procedures to totally turn it completely off, dead, in orbit, or to activate it from a dead state in orbit. That was not a set of procedures that we either had or thought we needed. So the whole technical aspects of doing that in an early process, power down and powered up, and of course then the emotional aspects of I've got to turn down I got to turn it off, the very module that takes you there and gets you there. It was a philosophical hurdle as well as a technical hurdle in this room.
With the command module as good as dead, Mission Control decided that their only option was to move the crew into the lunar module.
We had caused, on the flight before 13, the crew to have to use the LEM as a lifeboat, the lunar module as a lifeboat. And it was a massive electrical failure that we'd given them, you know, and that caused the event to occur. And it worked quite well, and everybody took a look at those lifeboat procedures and was kind of prepared in a mental sense, put them back in the corner, never thinking that we'd ever really have to do anything like that.
So we started thinking in terms of using the LEM lifeboat, not knowing where that's going to take you next because you can't come home in the lunar module.
In the course of the evening, you know, I guess one way to think of ourselves is we were a little bit of a almost a MASH hospital in a sense, in that we had to stabilize the situation and shut the command module down as gracefully as we could and get the crew moved over and power it up in the lunar module, and then do a lot of things with it that we had not planned for or trained for, and all that time not make any bad mistakes that would compromise how things might turn out at the end of the mission.
The lunar module was small, cramped, and designed for only 2 crew members to spend about 20 hours on the surface of the moon, and didn't even have any chairs. Now it would have to be called on to support all 3 crew members for at least the 4 or 5 day flight back to Earth.
We formed up a team in the back room that kind of got into Coca-Cola and sat down and said, okay, now we've been through that traumatic experience, now what do? We got to figure out how to get home. Or if we can get home, how we get through the entry sequence. When we started sampling out everybody's technique for what they need to get home, I was doing some mental arithmetic in my head, and I said, guys, we can't do it like that. I mean, we don't have anywhere near the kind of power to entry batteries to do this anywhere close to a nominal sequence.
Everyone at Mission Control, including the flight crew, did some mental calculations of what power and consumables remained in the spacecraft, and came to the conclusion that the crew would be lost.
Fred Hayes on the back of an old envelope was going back and forth and saying, you know, Jim, we don't have enough electrical power to get home.
So the conclusion was either we weren't going to make it or we're going to do this in such a different way, in a way that we never thought of before. That was the only 2 possibilities. And so I approached it from the standpoint was not so much that given it was impossible, because that was unthinkable to talk about, So we basically, as a team, backed into, well, given it's impossible, let's don't work it that way. Let's talk about it. What would it take to make it possible?
And so a team was formed under Gene Kranz with all of the participants involved, the dynamics people, the trajectory people, the lunar module people, and the Apollo Command and Service Module people, to get together now and see, what does this mean to our mission?
What Gene did was to put John in the position of you're the guy that's got to come up with a final plan, working with all the people. But John didn't work out the plan by himself. He had a lot of people, but he was the guy that became the power guru or the power czar to make sure that we played it right for the rest of the mission.
In the hopes of stabilizing the water and power resources, everything in the lunar module was shut down, even the heaters and guidance controls. All that could be left on was a small light, a fan, and radio contact with mission control. It was clear that this problem was going to require the combined efforts of every simulator engineer, systems analyst, backup astronaut, and computer technician. They were all called into the NASA centers in the middle of the night of April 13th.
You know, they were worried if they were going to keep the life support systems going long enough to get them back. And it was pretty shaky. They didn't know if the heat shield was going to work. I mean, after all, there had been this huge explosion. And it could have damaged the heat shield easily, and there's no way to test it. You don't know until you actually do re-entry if it's going to work.
Since all of the systems of the spacecraft would have to be pushed beyond the outer limits of their specifications, all of the contractors were also contacted for their expert opinions on what could be done to help rescue the crew. While most of America slept, control rooms around the country hosted crews of bleary-eyed technicians working on computers, slide rules, and simulators to come to a solution to this crisis.
People in Bethpage in New York that built the lunar module swung into action. Many of the people that supported them by building components that went into that, other contractors, swung into action. Hamilton Standard, the suit manufacturer, and some of the ECS controls, all of that swung into action. On the command module side, built by Rockwell in California, the same thing happened. They swung in action. They had test facilities. They had simulation capabilities that were unique, test chambers and so forth. All of that got turned on. It was a team effort clear across the country.
The first immediate challenge facing mission control was to change the trajectory of the spacecraft using the lunar module engines.
In the case of Apollo 13, because of the landing site and the lighting conditions that were desired, we actually diverted from the free return trajectory, that is, free return to the Earth after swinging around the moon, and we were on a trajectory which, had we not done any more burns, would never have returned anywhere near the vicinity of the Earth. And we knew that we had to perform some kind of a propulsion maneuver with one of the rocket systems in order to correct the trajectory and get ourselves swinging around the moon, but then coming back towards the Earth approximately in an entry corridor.
After this burn put the spacecraft on the correct flight path, debates immediately began to rage in mission control. The directors and management split into two separate factions on just how quickly to bring the crew home. One group wanted to jettison the useless service module to lighten the spacecraft and burn the lunar module's engine at maximum as it rounded the far side of the moon, bringing the spacecraft back to Earth as soon as possible. The other group argued if the service module was jettisoned, the command module's heat shield would be exposed to at least 4 days of the ultimate cold of space, risking possible deterioration. They pushed to leave the service module attached and take a more conservative but longer return to Earth.
We had managers who listened to the technical inputs of the members of the team and myself and Lonnie and a couple of the other flight directors. Said, hey, the way to do it is to take the long road home because we have the confidence we can stretch the limb. And again, what we have to do is we have to establish a strategy for coming home. We don't want to force ourselves into decisions early in the game. We got this LEM spacecraft. We've learned how to use it as a lifeboat. We ought to continue to use it as a lifeboat. We've got the ability to buy time.
The burn we decided on was to, as we passed the moon's closest point of approach, we call that pericynthion. 2 hours later, we decided to do a burn. And so we decided to take the easier or the more conservative approach and get them back where we had a carrier and get them back at 142 hours.
About 6 hours after the initial explosion, the final details for the pericynthion burn were being worked out by the backup astronauts in simulators and were ready to be radioed to Lovell.
They came up and said, "Are you ready to copy? The procedure I think will work." And I said, "Fine." My two companions were next to me. They started reading the procedures, and I started copying down everything, and I looked at my companions, and they weren't listening. They said, "Well, Jim, as we round the back side of the moon, the far side, we're going to take pictures." I said, "If we don't get home, you won't get them developed."
News of Apollo 13's problems broke like waves of shock and disbelief around the world in the morning of April 14th.
At the moment, the astronauts are continuing to try to isolate their trouble. A late report says the spacecraft now is operating on battery power alone. All unnecessary equipment is being turned off.
The media was now in a feeding frenzy about this mission and the danger that the crew faced. Many nations offered their support and facilities to the rescue mission.
We had the Russians. We were right in the middle of the Cold War, and the Russians came in and they offered the services of any ships they had to help us out. I mean, I can get misty about that time and place because it was just a getting together to save somebody, and that's what it was about.
The crew now faced another crisis. Their exhaled breath was creating a buildup of carbon dioxide. A chemical in canisters normally filtered out the carbon dioxide, but the system in the lunar module was becoming dangerously overburdened. The command module had several large square canisters, but the lunar module had only 2 small round ones. When the command module was shut down, its circulation system also shut down. The 3 astronauts would be dead of carbon dioxide poisoning at least a day before they could return to Earth, without something being done to filter out the carbon dioxide in the capsule.
When they came up with, we're running out of, the CO2 is building up, and what are we going to do? A couple of us were sitting there and said, well, that's easy. We did that on a sim for, I think, probably Apollo 8, where we found we could use the vacuum cleaner and blow air through the lithium hydroxide canister, and we wrapped it with plastic and gray tape, and says, yeah, and they'd call up somebody and say, hey, do you remember how we did that? And someone would remember who was on console during that sim and go get them, and they'd go off and say, now you guys go figure out how to do this and write that down as a procedure.
Joe Kerwin was one of the astronauts at the time, and Joe was working with the people in the chambers as to how we could best configure something like, configure a solution to that problem. Joe worked it all night, and then Joe was one of the guys who came in and radioed up the instructions to the crew on how to configure the system so that we would indeed continue to be able to use the scrubbers or the filters that didn't fit in the holes in the lunar module.
And we worked solid for 35 hours. And the more we worked, the better it began to look. And so I think within the first 24 hours, about the time they were arriving at the moon, I had a peace in my heart that we were going to make it. Unless some other major catastrophe happened, we were going to make it.
Once the crew swung around the moon and headed back toward the Earth, the oxygen supply appeared to be under control. But it still did not look like there would be enough electricity and water to make it back home. Astronauts and simulator engineers were working non-stop on procedures required for the crew's safe return.
We work very closely with the backup crew and the people who are running the simulators as part of this process, because once we started sketching out what we could afford from the standpoint of power, We started describing that, interacting with them. The backup astronauts brought their own ideas and techniques back into the procedures, negotiation.
We only had so much lifetime in the batteries, so we started turning things off, powering down the lunar module even, to lengthen the time of the batteries would last, so that the crew could last until they got back home. And that became very difficult because what we weren't sure of is just how cold it would get in the lunar module as we kept shutting things down. So again, it triggered another set of analyses. You know, people weren't just in the simulator playing these situations about what switches, what else can we turn off, how can we save a few watts here and there. But other people were back at the desks just analyzing reams of data about the real spacecraft. How much was this lamp worth? You know, how many watts did it burn, and so on.
While the ground crews were working on the reentry procedures, things got to be so cold in the lunar module that it was now a matter of survival just to be able to exist there for the trip back home.
The place was like the inside of a refrigerator. And for them to sustain that for as many days as they did, I think was a real test of their physical stamina. I'm not sure how much further they could have gone in those kind of temperatures. I think Fred got pretty ill, and he was shivering, and so it had to be miserable.
The crew, of course, we had them in a situation that was very uncomfortable. It was cold. It was damp. They were very short on water. It was a much higher priority to run the water boilers that cooled the spacecraft than it was for drinking water. We tried to the best of our ability to make it as comfortable as we could for them. But in reality, the flight crew knew and we knew that the subsystems got the first priority on water and power and temperature.
I had a number of debates with the engineers in the mission evaluation room about how cold certain subsystems would get, and if they would get so cold they would freeze and therefore cause a problem with the command module for entry. And so we struck a fine balance between projected temperature profiles for systems and power levels we could allow things to continue to run at.
Back on Earth, the reaction to the plight of Apollo 13 was worldwide and enormous. Creative genius that NASA was famous for was under the microscope of public scrutiny. It seemed as though everyone on the planet was united in prayer for the safe return of these three brave astronauts.
Lord, your astronauts will come back safe.
In the darkness and cold of space, Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert still had some doubts as to whether or not they could really be rescued, and were preparing themselves for the worst-case scenario.
When you're in a tight spot and there's really nothing to do and everything is quiet, it's bad news. You start to think. And I think it was Swigert that said, you know, we might be exceeding escape velocity. If we miss the atmosphere coming back in, we'll, of course, escape from the Earth, and, you know, that means going into an orbit about the sun. I said, well, fine.
Jim Lovell admitted one time that he thought, well, because there was a real chance that they were going to miss the Earth, you know, that they were going to literally be marooned in space. And Lovell told himself that if that happened, he was going to just stay on the radio and broadcast as long as he could, you know, and just send word back. You know, I mean, that's a pilot's attitude. They were pilots, you know, I mean, Lovell was glad that at least he was going to be at the controls. You know, he'd be flying his ship, whatever happened.
Even with all of the efforts to conserve electricity and return home faster, the spacecraft was still going to run out of critical resources just before it reached the point of reentry, and the mission and crew would be lost.
Some of our flight controllers picked a very ingenious way to flow power backwards from the lunar module to charge. We had a battery charger on board the command and service module. Of course, with the fuel cells gone and the oxygen tank gone, there was no way to power the battery charger. But they came up with an ingenious way to manipulate hundreds of circuit breakers. I wish I'd have kept that checklist, that to backflow power from the lunar module to the command module.
That complicated maneuver put another 10 to 15% of electricity back into the command module batteries and gave the crew barely enough power needed to initiate the re-entry procedures. 16 hours before re-entry, the crew went back into the command module to prepare for their final procedures. The capsule was so cold that the windows and gauges were covered with frost. The water supply was already gone. The crew members were exhausted and hoping that their spacecraft would hold together for just a few more hours. Because the command module was still connected to the service and lunar modules, the single most complex maneuver of this mission was first to separate from the service module, then from the lunar module, and re-enter the atmosphere in such a way as not to run into either of them on the way down.
The folks planning for the entry portion of the mission had a variety of new things to consider, plus they were also very constrained by the limited amount of electrical power we had in the 3 entry batteries. So everything that they did had to be constrained to how much power that we would really have there and how far we could stretch those batteries and, you know, bring the thing off successfully.
As we got closer to re-entry, John and I began to get concerned about powering up were we giving them enough time to power up the command module, and was the maneuvers that Jim Lovell had to do in the lunar module to get them in the right attitude, did we have that figured out right?
We finally ended up with a complete set of procedures, which we then sent over to the simulator and gave it to a cold crew, because it wouldn't do any good for me to go run the procedure since I had essentially put it together. I would do it right anyhow without the language being correct. So we gave it to a cold crew that had not had anything to do with it, in hopes of catching any ambiguous phrasing or things that would be difficult.
We got concerned about that, so we ran to the simulator, and sure enough, I mean, we were going to come within 10 degrees of that critical maneuver. So we talked flight control into abandoning that maneuver, and let's just stand with a safe attitude, and when we separate, then we will reorient and get things done, and that's what we did.
The astronauts on the ground were invaluable during this period. They were very knowledgeable and knew exactly what was happening upstairs, but they also were enabled to do that because of the great simulation capability, which I think will forever be one of the unsung major reasons that we had the successes that we did. Even when things worked right, they were invaluable, but when things went wrong, they were really just absolutely necessary.
The crew jettisoned the service module first, then tried to swing around to get a look at the damage caused by the oxygen tank explosion.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. Is that right?
Just before re-entry into the Earth's upper atmosphere, the lunar module was jettisoned.
Okay, copy that. Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you.
I think we felt reasonably comfortable that once we got the command module separated from all this excess hardware now, that it was going to work okay, because we had checked those systems out, and we had brought the systems back online. We had all the systems working about an hour before we got ready to do that separation work, and I think we were reasonably satisfied it was going to work okay.
Everyone realized there could have been damage to the heat shield, parachutes, or any of a dozen other potential problems, resulting in the loss of the capsule and crew.
All those things were on our mind, but not very high level, in the sense that for the most part there were things we couldn't do anything about. They were of what we would call a hand-wringing type, and if we couldn't do anything about them and we couldn't figure out any way, if there weren't any defenses against their implications, we generally walked past it and said, well, if it is, so be it. If it's not, we'll be okay.
When the heat shield of a spacecraft traveling 20,000 miles an hour first comes into contact with the upper atmosphere, it becomes red hot from the friction. The superheated air around the capsule creates a radio blackout for several minutes. Based on prior missions, the blackout time had been calculated down to the second.
In the case of Apollo 13, I mean, they were supposed to be, say it's 3 minutes and 10 seconds in blackout. And so after, they're watching the clock and it gets down to 3 minutes and 10 seconds and they wait to hear from them. And they don't hear anything. I mean, the parachutes worked because, they'd been frozen out there in outer space all this time. Maybe the parachutes didn't work. Maybe the heat shield didn't work. All these things that maybe didn't work. And it's 3 minutes and 30 seconds and 3 minutes and 40 seconds. And I think it went past 4 minutes.
You could have heard a pin drop in that control center. I mean, it was just quiet as it could be. Only the Capcom every once in a while calling, Apollo 13, this is Houston. Apollo 13 is Houston, do you read? Finally, about something like 4.5 minutes of total blackout. I think it was Jack. It may have been Jim, but it may have been Jack Swagger. Hello, Houston, this is 13, how you read? And
Okay, we read you, Jack.
almost casually.
We had a report that a RIA 4 aircraft has acquisition.
Re-entry was clearly the most widely watched worldwide event in the history of television. Everyone certainly expressed a simultaneous sigh of relief, then cheer, as they saw the parachutes come out and drop the capsule into the ocean in full sight of the rescue teams and television cameras.
We opened the doors to this room, and these hundreds of people would come into the room, all of whom had one little piece of this mission, but without whom we couldn't have done this mission. There was just a feeling of togetherness, bond, unity, accomplishment. It was just the most marvelous feelings in my entire life that existed in this room.
Perhaps the most important aspects of this particular mission were the overall implications of this rescue.
I think it's a real tribute to the way NASA does business that not one thing that we did had to be invented from scratch. I'm convinced that virtually everything that we did had been done in a simulation somewhere, sometime prior to that mission. The only thing we did was to package them in a different order.
I think the great thing about Apollo 13 is that it really shows that it's not all about technology. I mean, like, even when all the gadgets fail, these people can still pull it out. I mean, or they did in that case. I mean, it just shows what the level of ingenuity is, I mean, just the determination of the people involved, the commitment to make it work, to rescue their friends, fundamentally. I mean, these were all their friends that are out there, lost in space, and they were going to get them back. They were determined to get them back. They weren't going to accept no for an answer, and they pulled it off.
We went into space as a country in response to a major challenge. We went there to learn about space. We went there to learn about ourselves. We went there to explore. We went there to be able to go out beyond that even. In that context, I would view that in terms of opening up space, in terms of being confident in our ability to do things, Apollo 13 was really a tremendous success.
None of the 3 crew members of Apollo 13 went into space again. Jim Lovell had already promised his wife that this was to have been his last mission. Jack Swigert went into politics and was elected as a congressman, but died of cancer before taking office. Fred Hayes went on to do development work on the space shuttle, but retired before its first flight. T.K. Mattingly, who was replaced for this mission, eventually did go to the moon on Apollo 16, along with John Young and Charles Duke. Mattingly was also the commander of 2 space shuttle missions, becoming a veteran astronaut himself. Perhaps the Apollo 13 mission showed the world beyond any shadow of a doubt just how much could be accomplished when the success of a mission was the only thing that mattered, where thousands of people contributed anonymously towards achieving that single goal and taking pride in the team effort without any self-serving attention given to any one individual. No matter what the challenge, mankind has the ability to rise to the occasion.